that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us for, I think, a good segment of robotics. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I wanted to just orient everyone a little bit on ways that robotics are incorporated in not just everyday life, but kind of up and coming different applications, and kind of end towards the areas of a lot of the lines of research that we all work in. So I'm going to kind of fly through this because it's really just, I think, like just cool images and applications just to kind of make people aware of different ways that we use robotics in the life sciences. So, you know, there's a lot of, with drug development and laboratory processes, these are good ways to automate that, reduce human error, improve those manufacturing abilities in those laboratories. There's even like micro robotics that have health applications, including delivering drugs or artificial insemination. So we can, you know, there's robotics of all size, very large scale, moderate, and then all to these very micro scale and even nano robotics. All right, we're gonna have to go next because this is not working again. There we go. There's also a lot of work with trying to help people communicate when they're far apart, right? So we all had the pandemic, we talked over Zoom. Robotics has a role in that too, and I kind of have the Big Bang Theory example there where you can attach essentially a tablet to a little robot that walks around with you, but it's a way that we can virtually interact in a way that's not just with a screen, but with something that you can walk around with, and it can be used in healthcare to check on patients, as well as help with general communication tools and things like that. Next, please. And you know, newer applications are also incorporating things like augmented and virtual reality. These are really good ways to incorporate training environments where you can't necessarily have the field experience, either it's dangerous or inaccessible for some reason. But it's a good way to aid that training. You know, even in medical areas, they can do like dental procedures in VR. So there's, you know, it's really getting incorporated all over the place. Next. And kind of getting now more into some of the topics we'll talk about today. There's, you know, a lot of work with developing surgical robotics so that they can be done not just with the doctor in the room performing the procedure, but also for telesurgery. So say for remote access to surgical procedures, having that telerobotic surgery so that you can actually do these procedures on people without having to bring them from these remote areas. So there's, you know, a lot of development into that, looking at not just replacement and this telework, but also as maybe an extra set of hands as you're doing the procedures. Next. There's also a lot of, you know, I think like the Jetsons dream coming true with the assistive robotics, which is not just medical, but also just with daily life, right? So, you know, we'd all love something to clean up after us all the time. We kind of had, you know, there's the Roomba and all of those things. But even I saw a video of the feeding robot where someone was just working on their computer and they just needed a hand to feed them as they worked. So maybe the ultimate multitasking tool. So, you know, we can have these robotics applications for these kind of handy but not necessarily critical applications, which I think are more widely applicable as well. And next. And yeah, maybe I'm biased here because this is kind of my field, but I think there's a lot of examples of robotics in mobility and rehabilitation, and several of our panelists, they'll introduce themselves, and this is also a space we're going to be talking about today, but you know, incorporating robotics into wheelchairs to help people get around, exoskeletons to assist movement, prosthetic limbs that replace limbs that are lost, you know, assisting movements that they're trying to do. You can have, you know, someone who's bedbound maybe assisting with their physical therapy, so you don't have to have 4 physical therapists on them at all times. You can have that robot kind of replace that, and it is also safer for the therapist. So there's a lot of considerations here with incorporating these devices into the mobility and rehabilitation realm that is good for patients and for providers. And next, we might be near the end here. Yeah, good, okay. So with that, I would just like to give an opportunity for all of the panelists to do a quick introduction of themselves, and then we'll get started on some of the discussion. And we have lots of questions prepared, but if there's, you know, really burning questions or just curious questions from the audience, we would love to hear from you and really just get this discussion going between everyone up here and all of you down there.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Not sure if, okay, this is on, great. My name is Josh Miller. I'm the CEO of Biologic Input-Output Systems. It's a joint project between the University of Utah, ourselves, and the Mayo Clinic. And effectively what we've done is we've developed a device that can read and write neural signals in real time. And it's an AI-driven capability, but the point is, as the nerve signals propagate through your body, we can capture those nerve signals, translate that into a digital output, and then send it to any digital device, whether it's a prosthetic hand or anything. And likewise, we can send sensation and feedback signals back up to the brain in the natural format. And so I was really excited to talk on this panel, to be part of it, because some really exciting work is taking place at the University of Utah.
Awesome. So I'm Laura Hallock. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Utah in the mechanical engineering department, also by courtesy in physical medicine and rehabilitation. I work on human modeling for assistive and rehabilitative robotics, primarily for the upper limb, for survivors of things like stroke, spinal cord injury, working on ways to better sense what's happening in the human body, currently largely non-invasively using technologies like EMG, motion capture, ultrasonography, but potentially moving towards stimulation and more invasive technologies as well.
My name is Jake Abbott. I'm a professor at the University of Utah. I work in surgical robotics kind of broadly and have for a couple of decades now. And so over that time, I've worked on a lot of different kind of flavors of medical robotics. Some of them are teleoperation systems. You can picture something like a Da Vinci. So you have the surgeon would be at a console, which are haptic devices that are measuring input, but also providing forces back potentially, and then remotely operating some robot. I'm still working on that right now, actively on a new class of eye surgery robots that are mounted directly to the person's head. It turns out while you're getting eye surgery, you're moving the whole time just because you can't stop breathing. And eye surgery is so difficult that those little movements make a big difference. And then a big class of my research is on the use of magnetic fields in surgical robotics, and maybe not even surgical, but let's say medical, even diagnostic things. So the great thing about magnetic fields is they can, pass right through a human body. So now you can put a small thing into your vasculature or into your GI tract. You can swallow something, and if it's a magnetic thing, you can now control that thing throughout your body. I've also worked on magnetic micro-robots over the year. That's actually how I got into this field of using magnetism. So if anyone's interested in talking about micro-robots, I have experience in that as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Tommaso Lenzi and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. I direct the Hans Georgenader Lab for Bionic Engineering at the U, and a lot of my experience in the space of prosthetics and exoskeletons, and fundamentally we are building technologies that help people with disability to move and live independently. One of the projects that we worked for probably the longest time is the Utah Bionic Leg, which is the first robotic leg prosthesis that is capable of replicating the function of the leg from the knee to the ankle to the foot and toes. And this is a project that I've received a lot of attention in the last couple of years. It was nominated by Time magazine as one of the best inventions in 2023. And recently the University of Utah acknowledged that as a breakthrough of the year. And what is really exciting about this, and what I'm really focusing on right now, is translating these technologies from the lab to the real world. And so we have partnered with industry, and now we're in the phase of developing this technology into an actual product that can reach everyone and hopefully help people live more independently.
All right, thank you, panelists. I think we have a really good distribution of applications of robotics from micro to macro and different implementations, upper limb, lower limb, also through the translational process, right? So from the development to the kind of like clinical, preclinical testing, as well as all the way through to commercialization and implementation. So I think it's all fair game for questions today. I was curious actually about the micro robotics, because you're telling people they're swallowing magnets, and I feel like we've all been told not to do that. And now you're saying, oh wait, no, you should do it, but I guess in a supervised setting. But I feel like that's very counterintuitive, but I think like just a super cool application that I don't think we hear enough about. So that just came to mind to me. I was like, you don't swallow magnets, right? But
Would you like me to address that, or are you
you can, yeah.
foreshadowing some future question?
Yeah, if you want to go into a little bit more detail,
Yeah, so
because I'm curious.
So first of all, strong permanent magnets are these neodymium alloys, and they are toxic. So you don't want to permanently have these permanent magnets in you, but you can seal these magnets. They come, when you buy them, they come sealed to some degree, and you can further seal them. But the notion is, hopefully, these things aren't staying in your body, they're passing through. The thing I'm the most interested in personally is the GI tract. I would like to completely change the way you get a colonoscopy, or don't even think about it as a colonoscopy, because your colon, it's the most important part of your GI tract, but it's not the only part. Like the stomach is also important, and the esophagus is also important, and the small intestines. And we could have it be so you go into a clinic. Think about something closer to a dental visit, right? So you're gonna go in. You probably have to take your belt off. You won't have to get undressed. You swallow something. You lay down, and over the course of an hour, you have a complete scan of your GI tract. And it's not scary, and it's not embarrassing. And if you find something, you probably have to go back. But for lots of people, you don't find something. But maybe this is the way to completely change the paradigm of how people are scared of this. But that's going to have a magnet inside of it, but it comes out the other end. Yeah. The other fear people have of magnets, and why little kids shouldn't swallow magnets. Kids are funny in that they often swallow magnets not all at once. They swallow them sequentially. So what happens is you swallow a magnet, and it starts working its way through your small intestine, and then later you swallow another magnet, and then they eventually reach each other. They're not together, they're in different parts of your intestines, but when they reach each other, they kind of hook together through the walls, right? And they don't move, and then that becomes a real problem. Yeah.
Hopefully never.
Surgical robots after that.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, then you need a surgical robot to pull that out. I would say hopefully no one has firsthand experience with that, because that just is awful. I do want to pivot to real questions, though, in all seriousness, although you bringing up the colon also made me think of the blow-up colon that's in the displays today, which is super cool if anyone hasn't gone through that arch yet. Very, very interesting setup, very, very neat setup here. But I wanted to pivot because I know a lot of people here are working on the deployment, and a lot of that has clinical engagement at different levels. And just wanted to, maybe one or two of you, if you have a lot of experience or opinions and thoughts of how you think that we can maybe bridge that engineer/research gap with the clinicians, and how we can get things moving more, I guess, aside from just the FDA process and the funding process, but more of the getting clinicians to pick up the technology that we are developing and get them to trust it or learn something new after their training to do that. Maybe some limitations or approaches on how to approach that and bridge that.
Well, I mean, I feel like Tommaso has the more translational aspect of this. I still live my life pretty much on the research side, but I think one really unique thing about the University of Utah in particular is that it's one of the few places in the country that we actually do have a really strong robotics center, in addition to the Nielsen Hospital, sort of the orthopedics department. There's a lot of actual buy-in on the clinical side that for me, I mean, I actually just started at the University of Utah in January, but it's where I wanted to land because there's already clinicians there who are super excited. I'm working on these sort of brand new foundational post-stroke rehabilitation technologies, and I've already had conversations with some of the occupational therapists, working on getting into talking to patients as well. The head of the stroke program, the head of the spinal cord injury program, everybody there is kind of pushing forward these technologies, which is, I think, remarkable, having spent places at other institutions, I won't pick on anyone, but other institutions where even that do have ostensibly both these clinical and sort of engineering programs, often there is a huge amount of institutional inertia, a huge amount of resistance to those kinds of collaborations, even at the academic level. And so I think Utah in particular is actually quite well positioned in this space. I know you guys are much more established here and can probably speak to the practicalities of the more translational piece, getting your technology out there. But
If I can, we're in the midst of our FDA approval process for our device, and we've had 8 human trials to date. We're about to start our 9th right now, and in March this year we were granted breakthrough device designation by the FDA, and part of that was an invitation into what they call their TAP program, which is their advisory program to help breakthrough technologies get through the FDA faster and easier. I think to underestimate the challenges of going from an engineering lab to a commercially available product, and it's a mistake. It's very difficult. It's very time consuming, and it's very expensive. I think the first thing you need to acknowledge, and this is often a challenge people overlook, is you need to identify a really clear commercial want and commercial need by a group of people and that are willing to pay money for your product to solve a problem. And you need to address that really, really clearly. And then you've got a whole host of stakeholders that are involved in this process. The FDA is the obvious one, but you've also got the payers, the insurance companies, CMS. They need to grant you a code in order to reimburse you for that product. The Veterans Administration is an entirely different organization with a different process, different rules, different procedures. You've got workman's comp is just another example. You've got patient groups and doctor groups, and if your product involves any sort of a surgical procedure, you've got to train up armies of doctors, clinicians, nurses, therapists, rehab specialists, et cetera. And so, they often refer to the gap between breakthrough technology and commercial market as Death Valley, because it is very difficult, and it's really unfortunate that a lot of really astounding technology never really sees the light of day, because that process is just very, very difficult. And I suppose it's difficult for a reason. You don't really want untested AI messing with your brain on a regular basis, but it is possible, and there are resources out there, and I'm just speaking from personal experience to reinforce what you said. The University of Utah is outstanding in that area. I think they get it. I think they put a lot of resources into bridging that gap, but it takes a lot of time and a lot of money and a lot of really smart people working together, so I don't want to downplay that.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, I think you're definitely right, and part of it is that, you see there's research, and academic research is really on one side, and then there's a real world on another side, and unfortunately there's a big gap between these two, and so oftentimes I think clinicians or even patients don't want to use these technologies because they're not really good technologies, they just don't really address the need, and so kind of back to what you were saying, and so from my perspective, I think starting very early on, involvement of end users. And end users are not just the patients, they're also the clinicians, the physicians. They're gonna use these technologies and prescribe these technologies on their daily basis. I think it's very, very important. And I think, yeah, we are definitely doing well here, and we're very lucky to have these resources, but there's still like a lot more that we can do, I think, especially when it comes to involving like end users. And so I think that's a difficult process, and it's something it's a challenge that we love to tackle, I think, the University of Utah. It is something that is going to help us down the road developing good technologies. And then there's another aspect that I think is also very important, but the business model, right? I think that's another very important thing that oftentimes in academia is not really valued or understood. But the reality is that if you may have like a great technology that patients and clinicians like, but if nobody can pay for it, it's just useless. And so there's also an aspect of very early on trying to understand, even in the best case scenario, even if you solve all the engineering problem, how much of a solution do you have in your hands? And I think this is something that I would like to see more personally. It's something that I try to focus more and more as I go on with my career. And I think it's key to the development of good technologies for assistance and rehabilitation, at least.
I don't really have much to contribute here. I also have liked to live in the kind of basic research phase. I find that's where my passion lies, and I get excited about sort of doing something the world has never seen done before. And then I'm actually pretty good about getting the University of Utah to to patent the technology, and then I sort of want someone else. I would be happy to participate, but I ultimately want someone else to take it and run with it and commercialize it, and I'm kind of already on to the next thing.
Yeah. Actually, I think I fall into that camp as well. I don't have the biggest business interests, but I would love to just make discovery contributions and then hand it to people who are good at business. and they can take the business side. But I love the commercialization that we have at the University of Utah. We can put in those patents. We can still make those business contributions, but also we're experts in our fields, and business experts exist, and we don't necessarily all overlap. But I appreciate all of the camps, because I think either way, as long as you can get those devices forward into those pivotal trials, getting that funding, making sure that it's useful, engaging those end users, you can still do all of that and not necessarily do everything yourself, I think.
Yeah, and I think what Tommaso is saying about even if you are living on the academic side, really still there's a ton of academic research that conceptual is really cool, coolest new algorithm, makes us all excited, that is fundamentally useless. This happens a lot, I think, in the rehab and assistant space. People talk about the closet full of arms problem when it comes to generating prosthetic devices. People don't actually use them for very practical reasons. And so I think that's one of the things that I'm trying to do here at Utah. I think it's one of our comparative advantages is, okay, there's a wide world of these really fascinating conceptual basic science foundational problems. What are the ones that are actually going to move the needle forward translationally, even if I am still living on that sort of basic science side of the spectrum?
Yeah, closet full of arms is good, because I think a lot of us are engineers here, and I think sometimes if you don't engage the end users, and maybe we'll hammer home this point, this is my soapbox, you can't just engineer something and then give it to someone and expect them to use it without them being engaged. And I think this hits to Tommaso's point, and a lot of the points that are being made is as engineers, we have to consider who's using it, both from the people who are using these devices, either rehabilitation, the patients versus caregivers versus the clinical side, and not just the doctors, but the therapists as well. Because if you just give them something that's way too complicated and difficult to use, non-intuitive, breaks frequently, they can't debug their arm, right? So I think as engineers, we have to bridge that ourselves too, because we can't just be in our lab, make these really cool devices, and then get mad at people for not liking it, because in your mind, it's the best thing ever, right? That's not a practical solution, and I think that's where we really need to engage everyone at every level, I think, and keep that in mind as we go through our iterative design process. So I do want to not really, just have us talking to each other. So if there's any questions from the audience, give a nod or a wave. Maybe I'll cold call people. Just kidding. Yeah, I know a few students in the crowd, and they're smirking. I think if you're curious about even just some of the the technology side, the application side, development, deployment. What do we have at the University of Utah? What about the industry connections we have here? Because I think it's very clear from the show out today, but also, it's a good reputation here of being a very good tech hub in this area, both on not even just medical robotics, but robotics in general. So if anyone has any thoughts, otherwise we can keep going. Yes, Diego.
Who are you directing that question at? Are you directing at the
two of you, I think.
You have something to say?
Yeah.
I suppose. Then you're getting into the BCI space, the brain-computer interface space, which I think is going to be the biggest area that sees the most explosive growth over the next little while. The gap between robotics and biology is always analog up till now. So there's a joystick, there's a keyboard, there's some sort of analog input-output device, which from a data throughput is exceptionally slow. And what we're trying to do is erase that barrier so that you can communicate intuitively through your nervous system. In order to access those signals, though, you do need to implant electrodes into your nervous system, whether it's your brain, your peripheral nerve, your medial nerve, whatever it is. And those surgical are, you're talking very, very precise areas where, being off by a fraction of a millimeter can make a big difference when you're talking individual axon nerve cells. And so, yeah, robotics is it's going to become commonplace, in my opinion. I would differ with you slightly on the term invasive. I think when they drill a hole in your skull, I deem that invasive. as opposed to, accessing the peripheral nerve. But regardless, the precision required, I think, is something that, typically human coordination is just not capable of.
We're actually working on a technology at the U. Dr. Alan Kuntz and I, we have one paper published on it so far, and it's a new kind of steerable needle. There's this new, there's a class of robotics problems known as steerable needles, where you basically take a very long, thin needle, you put some sort of asymmetric tip on it, like a beveled tip, and when you push that needle in, if it's thin enough, it's flexible, it'll want to bend in the soft tissue, and then by twisting it as you push it, then the bending direction will change, and you can make these take curved paths. But they suffer from a couple of problems. Like one is the idea, this is a very common problem in the world, and there's been many, many, many PhD students who've been graduated on this topic, basically. But there's two problems. It's the standard problem that is true of all sorts of endoscopes and catheters, and it's this idea, the push and pull, no pun intended, between making things very soft and very stiff. If you want to push something in, you need it to be stiff. You can imagine if something's soft enough, it just kind of squishes and buckles on you. But if you want something that can comply to its environment, it needs to be soft, and you can't do both at the same time. So this is always the trade-off. Steerable needles have the additional problem that they actually require the stiffness of the tissue to make them turn. The only way they can turn in tissue is because the tissue is sort of fighting against them and they can turn. So we've created this new kind of steerable needle that inverts that paradigm, and what it does is it says, well, the fundamental problem is that you're pushing it all. So we put this little magnetic screw at the tip, and so you still have the ability to gently push, just to sort of pull up the slack, kind of gently push, and you still have the ability to twist, but now that twisting action causes the whole thing to twist, and the screw at the tip screws, and then it pulls itself through tissue. And then because it's got a magnet in it, we can steer it magnetically, and because we can steer it magnetically, we don't need any sort of cables or anything that would stiffen it. So what you get is this very, very floppy thing that you can insert basically wherever you want. You can make really tight turns. You can even make things that can double back on themselves, which you could never do with any other class of pushable thing. You can't ever go beyond 90 degrees. It's actually difficult to even make a 90-degree turn with a pushable thing. So it's a completely different paradigm, and you could imagine every time you stick an electrode in the brain, if each one is of this class, then you can make each one take a very, very precise and very targeted path. The thing that freaks people out is the idea if people are like, I don't want a screw drilling through my brain. And it's the same thing if it's like, well, we're already talking about a needle drilling through your brain. And so the question is, what's the relative damage of the screw compared to the needle? And then, if you can take a path that's much more favorable, is that actually less damage overall? Like, what's the way to even quantify damage? Like, what's our cost function? That's something we're spending a lot of time thinking about now.
Probably a good way to avoid blood vessels,
Exactly.
right? Things like that. Maybe take a path that, through different areas and do less damage. And sometimes, unfortunately, a lot of those needle insertions in the brain are trial and error a little bit if they don't get the right target, right?
Yeah,
and that might reduce, that risk.
Yeah, and it can take, depending on the shape of the body you're trying to, let's say you're trying to ablate a body that's something that's giving you seizures, for example. And so what you basically do is you stick a needle in, but you imagine a straight path, and you burn that tissue, and now you have dead, burnt, necrotic tissue in your brain. But what's the chances you were able to cover the whole thing? So it might require a second insertion. So you just did 2 needle insertions that were this long, and maybe we could do 1 insertion that's this long and actually cover the entire thing. There's a little more damage associated with that 1 potentially, but when you compare it to 2, it's way less damage. So these are all, but this is still very much like basic science research now.
I can see maybe similar challenges with the trust factor, though, because it almost sounds like you're putting a little magnetic worm in a brain and it's drilling around. And maybe I shouldn't make that analogy and put that in people's minds. But I kind of see it as the similar trust issue with AI, and similar to the previous panel, where you know, the technology is now getting so advanced that a lot of people have a hard time trusting it, and it's hard to really fathom how it works, because I think we come from such a mechanical society. Even like our cars were so mechanical, now they're all electronic. There's a lot of trust issues there, and I think we're running into the same same problems as we get into more advanced robotic systems as well, right? And even on the micro scale, it's, you know, if you can't see it, how do you trust it? And I think we have to approach it, you know, with a lot of things that we do in medicine where we don't understand it, but we have to trust who has developed it and who has provided it for us, knowing that it is the best issue.
Yeah, it's so funny this topic is coming up because just an hour ago, we were in the robotics seminar that Tommaso is running this semester, and he had a speaker from Vanderbilt University, and this is exactly her research topic, and basically what she's doing, and we actually have people at the U who do research similarly. Alan Kuntz does, that's why she was a good speaker. But you know, the way they think about this is it's basically like the planning problem is too complicated, so what you do is you use a sophisticated motion planning algorithm and a lot of computational power. You plan maybe 100 paths, and then you just show them to the surgeon and say, pick one. You know, and that's how you're sort of overcoming the trust issue, is just always having a human in the loop.
Yeah.
You know.
Make them feel like the decision maker in the end.
Yeah, and then of course, even during runtime, you know, as you're doing these insertions, you're seeing where they're going, and maybe you're calculating a new risk factor, and you can always stop it or choose not to advance any further, and you can pull it back. So it's not that fundamentally different from other kinds of surgical robots that people are already familiar with.
I'd like to add on that. I think really interesting things happening right now is the FDA has been approving fixed AI algorithmic machine learning components for about 30 years now. So you see them often in like radiology, for example, how to read a radiological report. It's common. The important thing about those AI algorithms is they're fixed versus generative. And the FDA has not approved a single generative device yet. And so that's a device that can react in real time to a changing environment with data input. And we're attempting to do that with several other people in different companies. But the idea is would you allow an AI algorithm to read and write the signals that your brain receives without human input, without a human involved in the middle? And yeah, I imagine there is a trust issue, absolutely. It's going to happen. It's simply a matter of time. And you know, how we deal with that, I don't know.
Well, I actually do really like the human in the loop as a sort of, I mean, you could consider it a stopgap measure, or you could also just consider it as a foundational piece of whatever system you're building, because I think in the rehab space as well, I think there's a lot of these problems, whether surgical, whether sort of rehabilitation, assistance, all those things. Humans are really complicated, right, at every level of abstraction. And for whatever, for example, you know, I have a project right now on post-stroke rehabilitation. There's so much that we just found. There's so many like very foundational, you know, aspects of the field that are very contentious in terms of if I were to build a robot to rehabilitate someone, there is no consensus on exactly what that robot should even do. Should it be, you know, resisting someone's motion? Should it be assisting them? Under what circumstances? Should we have, you know, a stimulation system? There's a lot of, it's so hard to do that kind of research in any kind of longitudinal way, since ultimately you want people to recover, that there's just, you know, biological questions that we don't know the answer to. And so that means, I think in order to move forward on a lot of these systems, I think about it as sort of carving out pieces that, okay, robots are also, in addition to being, you know, able to actuate in the world, they're also this really standardized platform for sensing. How can we start to, you know, use a robot to give clinicians more information, sort of similar to the, you know, give the surgeon a bunch of different paths for their robotic device, give the clinician a standardized metric for, you know, how well a particular patient was performing on a rehabilitation robot. And they can use that information to sort of guide their rehabilitation moving forward. And so I think, I guess, comes back to another push for involving people at many levels of the process, but I think there's a huge amount of sort of innovation that can happen without relying totally on autonomy, and just saying we're gonna have a robot plus AI that's gonna solve whatever clinical problem you're targeting.
Fantastic. Does anyone else have any questions for the panelists? Oh, one in the back. Or yeah, we'll start in the back. You can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Katie Swenson.
Yeah, that's a great topic, and it takes a lot of time. And we have people dedicated just to that topic alone, as I'm sure you're aware. The idea is insurance companies don't want to pay for anything they don't have to. I mean, that's not exactly news. They're running a profitable business, and so you need to offer them a product that they can, that is beneficial to them, and ultimately it's beneficial to the users. So you're balancing a lot of different requirements. I will say off the bat, though, that there's some really great legislation going through Congress right now. The TSET program was just approved not too long ago, which allows for breakthrough technologies to get a code for the first several years of operation to short-circuit that process. And there's some other House resolutions that we're watching really closely. But you need to have a long conversation with them. And I think, at the risk, I don't want to sound cynical. The truth is what they're looking for is, can you return people to productive, economically productive, socially productive lives where they don't require medical care anymore. And so one thing to look at really carefully, I think, is the specific indication that you're claiming to treat. I'll give an example of Neuralink. So Neuralink's underlying indication that they're asking approval for is total body paralysis. It's a very, very small market dollar-wise compared to other markets. And so, they can spend $400 million developing that technology, but then the market they're going to get to is going to be really, really small. It's also a very crowded market in terms of the therapeutics that patients require. And so insurance companies are very, very resistant to offering new additional codes for those products. And so ideally, finding a predicate that you can sort of glom onto before you get your own code, I think, is really, really important. Some companies have had a lot of success doing that. The FDA is also a great partner in that regard because they obviously work really closely with CMS in particular and with the VA and other aspects of having those discussions of why would this economically be a good idea for us as a company? Why would we want to pay for this? And so you need to have a really compelling case, and you need to have a lot of data and a lot of research behind it. So there's no short answer. It's a lot of legwork, but there are aspects that do speed up that process for sure. I don't know if that answers your question, but quite frankly, that's typically the single largest barrier to entry is reimbursement. It's the one thing that people who know the industry talk about the most, is convincing an insurance company to pay for something. So, yeah.
If I can just add, it's not even just a problem in the U.S. Like training in Canada, if we wanted to get technologies through, we would have to prove, it's similar reimbursement, just a different person who's reimbursing. It's government instead. But you would have to prove that your solution is more cost effective than what they currently have available. But sometimes the cost of the current solution is not widely available or accessible, right? One problem that comes to mind was pressure sores, and they're not always reported or inpatient records, how long they're lasting for. The ultimate cost of that is really hard to calculate in a dollar amount. And so if you're developing a technological solution to address that, how do you compare it to something that's not being measured? How do you ask the clinical providers to start documenting and measuring things that you need to be able to make your device deployable? And that now becomes a big administrative burden. It's a lot of this information is not easy to get. Maybe others have experience with getting access to that similar information. And ultimately, I think it's a huge barrier to even approaching that process.
Yeah, there's interesting. You can come at that problem from different ways as well. So, for example, we talked about closets full of arms. 7 out of 10 prosthetics are abandoned in the first year. So 70% of prosthetic users buy prosthetics. They cost up to $100,000 a piece, and they use it for a few weeks, a few months, and then they put it on the shelf. And demonstrating to CMS that you will prevent that from happening, that you give people functionality that they didn't otherwise have, that's been an effective argument for us. And so it's not necessarily what are you replacing. It can also be what are you enabling, what costs that are sort of ancillary are you affecting rather than your own, because these are expensive solutions. So yeah, the creative approach for sure.
If I can add something to that though, because I do think that the reality is that industry, especially when you look at prosthetics, is a very, very small market. And so rarely you have the kind of resources. So the reality is that unless we, as academia and federal government, steps in and do the clinical trials that we need to do to demonstrate the efficacy of these devices, that's not going to happen, right? And so these 7 out of 8 upper limb prosthetics are not used is because they weren't properly used. It's not because of reimbursement or anything. It's because they just don't work well. They shouldn't exist, right? It has been a waste of money probably to develop those devices. And part of it is that if we were able to test that clinically, preclinically at least in academia, we will have a better chance at selecting those technologies that go out and then convincing reimbursement, right? And I think that's the key part, because ultimately it has to be a win-win situation, right? You're not gonna be able to be successful without a win-win situation. And I think it's our job, I think, in academia to create the condition for this win-win situation. So creating the science fundamentally, the clinical science that then in the future allows for the reimbursement of these technologies, right?
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left. Nathan, do you still have a question? Yeah, I might give priority to a student if that's okay. Yeah? Okay. Go ahead.
Nathan Wallace, University of Utah. Looking at the reaching commercialization from, research project, robotics is such a dynamic field where you can rapidly improve your product. Looking at the bionic leg in the past 4 years, how far that's come. When you're commercializing, you have to get the regulatory submission complete. When in the process do you decide that it's when you submit for your 510K or your PMA, depending on how that is, because in 6 months you might have a better version. Yeah.
When to stop making it perfect and just go for it? Yeah.
Or if you just, I don't know.
Yeah, so if I can add to that, because that's exactly what we're going through right now with the Utah Bionic Leg. So it's actually really hard, right? Because if you go too soon, maybe you're missing the opportunity to improve on some key aspects and you're not going to have the chance anymore. If you go too late, on the other hand, again, you may be late on the market and just wasting a lot of money on reiterations that are not really making a big difference. And so it's very hard. But one thing that I can tell you that we're doing is that creating partnership between industry and academia really helps that. Because you can get to the point where you kind of freeze the development of the project and then it goes into the hands of industry, that it's going to go down to manufacturing and regulatory aspects and all of that. And at the same time, you can keep developing that on the research side of things and academic side of things, right? And then hopefully that will become a generation 2 or generation 3. And so hopefully there's kind of a little bit of a loop that you can create between industry and academia, and it's challenging to do. And I was lucky to have people in the tech transfer office at the U helping me with all of this, but I think that's key, kind of creating this loop to be able to do that.
I would say that that's an area where you probably want to hire a consultant who works with the FDA specifically on filing, because it's a discipline of its own that is actually quite complicated. But you should understand as well, it's not binary, freezing or unfreezing. It's what aspect needs to be frozen. So for example, we can replace the microprocessor on our control unit. We added a wireless capability, and the FDA didn't care about that. We cannot change our AI algorithm, though. We can't alter it in the slightest without prior approval. So to answer your question, it depends. It depends on what needs to be frozen and what doesn't. And the reality is, if the FDA has two goals: safety and efficacy, and everything falls in those two buckets. And so if a change is going to affect either of those two outcomes, safety or efficacy, then they want to know in advance.
No changing materials, right? That would be a big, I think even for implanted or external, they don't like that, right? Because then we have to do all the materials testing again. So yeah, that's another one. Yeah, I think we're pretty well at the end unless someone has anything burning to ask. Otherwise, oh yeah, in the back there.
I'm sorry that I'm not actually the best person to answer that. The thing I'm the most familiar with regarding cardiac applications is the stereotaxis system for magnetically steered catheters. And I know, for those of you who don't know how that works, basically what it is it is a commercial system. You lay down between two huge permanent magnets, and those two magnets rotate, and that applies a torque to the tip of this catheter, and you can use that to form a firm connection with an inner wall of the heart, and then you're going to again burn tissue so it stops firing because it shouldn't be firing. I know that that's a system that people aren't super happy with that use it. They say they can't get the contact force they want. And part of the reason they do that is because the magnetic system uses, in what is now, should I say this out loud, some kind of old-fashioned ideas, like before the way we've reconceptualized how to use magnetic fields to do things, and we could do it better now, you know. Yeah. Yeah, and it's a, you know, you need a really kind of special room for those two huge magnets. They're very strong and scary. They're very huge and heavy, but yet the field they generate at the heart is actually like pretty weak because they're so far away from you. You can do things a lot better by getting in really close with your magnetic sources. In terms of robotic surgery on the heart, I'm trying to think if I really know much about that, and I think I really don't. I'm sorry, I can't speak to it. Yeah, so we use, so you, of course you have a magnet in your capsule, but we do it with just a single magnet that's at the end of a robot, and we've developed our own kind of custom end effector that the magnet is a sphere, and it can spin continuously in any direction. And so what you should imagine is a robot arm holding this spherical magnet that it can make spin, and it just moves down above you, and then it applies forces and torques in the right times. So in the stomach, we've developed controllers that actually levitate the capsule. So picture the capsule actually sort of floating freely in fluid, and we can move it around like a little submarine. In the small intestines, it's got externally has a screw thread, and the small intestine squeezes down around it and essentially forms the female screw thread if the capsule is the male screw thread. And then by generating torque on this capsule, it propels itself, and we can even make it, you know, go against peristalsis. So there are certain people who have like Crohn's disease or something who regularly get capsule endoscopies, which is a passive camera pill that currently exists clinically. No guidance, no magnetic. But the very people who are getting these scans are the same people that have inflammation and strictures, and for some percentage of those people, the capsule never comes out the other end. And if they call it capsule retention, if it doesn't come out after 2 weeks, you got to go in surgically and get it. But with our technology, you could just drive it backward up to the stomach and then reach in and grab it. So you wouldn't have to have an open surgery because you can go against peristalsis. So it just completely changed the way you think about getting a scan of your intestines. You still have to do the prep the day before. So I think sometimes that's what people hate the most. But yeah.
All right, I think with that we'll wrap up, and I think that's the signal that everyone needs to go find the tunnel colon. Yeah, I think that's where we're landing. All right, thank you everyone, and thank you to all of our panelists.